Hey there, everybody. Looks like we're getting those last couple of trickles of people in. Got a good amount. Good morning, as always. Got some of the regulars. Hi, Dustin. Hi, Sam. Hello, Les. I see Tim Cornish is here and Kyle Matthews. Welcome, welcome. Okay. All right. Looks like people are mostly in here now, and I have pushed record, so that's good and important. All right. So today's topic, matrix versus console. This is a question that kind of comes up in some way or another all of the time. So uh, this mini masterclass, we're going to talk about sort of the key notes about consoles and matrices, what we should sort of keep in mind when we're thinking about them, how they contrast between one another, also how they compare, situations best for one over another, why we might pick one for a project or a job, and even some situations where we want to use both, which also tend to come up a lot. So let's jump right in. I guess to start, before I go too far, for those of you that are with me weekly, you know I like to ask what your experience is with consoles or matrices. So in general, whether if you want to be on camera, that'd be fine and do it over audio, or you want to type it in the chat, let me know kind of what you do for work, or where most of your projects, what you're doing day to day. That way I just get a kind of idea of who I'm talking to. Some of you, I do know what you do, but let other people know where you're coming from, your background, uh, when or why you may be running into a console or a matrix system processor of some kind. So we'll give that a second, and I will let the answers shower in. Okay, so we've got sound operator for House of Worship. Yep, that's a good one. It's always a good one. Love House of Worship work. And then we've got a couple. Let's see. Yep, touring mostly. Yep, that's a big one. You may have some interesting use cases for both. So that would be interesting. And I know I've got some great integrators in here. Yep. Oh, there we go. AV integrator, engineered sound systems, CAD designer. Oh, nice. So you know all about this stuff, all about these kinds of things. And let's see, I know we've got some other AV integrators, some people who work at some higher ed. I just know because I just know people on the internet. So, all right, front of house, awesome. Audio operator at church. Nice. No experience with matrices or digital mixers. Ooh, this will be very interesting for you, Michael, in that case. Okay, all right, so we've got a pretty good little mishmash here of people's backgrounds and kind of what we're talking about. So, audio engineer for my friend's band, I think, and run into live sound guys. Yep. All right, that sounds about correct. What I expect from this kind of crowd. So, good mishmash. All right, so like, what's a console? A console, and we're talking in some really generic terms here. If we're really kind of, I mean, truly being a little bit reductive, but that's kind of the point. It sums inputs together. You consider that a big old summing machine. Uh, oh, we've also got a system commissioner in Live Editor. Okay, nice, Kelly. Though this is perfect crowd for this. Perfect crowd. Okay, so console. You can consider it an input summer. You could also kind of consider it, balancing inputs, an input balancer, usually between one another to make things sound, correct or balanced, so that two people standing on stage sound like they are the same level when they're coming out of the system. They typically adds some kind of amplification, whether that's through a preamp or using a bunch of just pushing up every single fader and doing a ton of digital trim and gain adjustments along the way. Typically, it's going to have some kind of amplification in the process. It also really kind of compensates for imperfections. The whole reason that consoles exist is to, one, balance the inputs together, and two, to compensate for things that aren't perfect on stage. If you really think about it, in a perfect world, if everything was coming off the stage perfectly, so the band was playing perfectly, and we had the tools, the microphones, and everything to capture those things perfectly, we would purely just be amplifying it. We wouldn't have to do any adjustments to it, but that's never the case. So we do a lot of compensation adjustments to help things sound correct or accurate, however you might want to describe that. So console also does that. This also includes some effects. So adding things like reverb or delays, or even using modeling amps for like tube preamps, or for different hardware compressors, or any number of things we may want to model and use as an effect or as an insert or something like that for our signal chain. So it does that. And really, it's a really interactive use. The whole point is being able to get our hands on something. And I know that in recent years, we've started to develop sort of these rack mount consoles, which are kind of a fun in between. And maybe we can open up that conversation in a little bit. But for right now, the whole point being you can get your hand on something, make adjustments very interactively, do what we need to do, get it done, and move on. And that we're able to make these adjustments as quickly and as easily as we possibly can. Just being able to reach for that knob that we need, making an adjustment, and again, moving on to the next thing or hitting our next cue or what have you. That is what a console is. So what's a matrix then? So a matrix is, just looking up the word matrix will get you nowhere in pro audio land. Hi Dale, I see your camera's on. We've got Jason on. Oh, so many cameras on. Hey everybody. So when you just like Google matrix, you actually get the mathematical sort of approach to it, like a rectangular array, which is, they're all kind of technically accurate, but in practice, it's a little bit harder to describe matrices like that. We can kind of just consider it the ability to put any input into any output. That's how we kind of approach matrices in pro audio world. So a matrix inside of a console, because our consoles have them, as well as other manufacturers have consoles that have a matrix or matrices on them. And those are typically used to sum buses together. It's a bus to combine outputs. And some of them also give you the ability to add inputs into that as well. So for instance, I know off the top of my head that an SQ comes with 3 matrices, and I can use those to bus together auxes or a couple of other buses together, sum those and send them someplace else. It's like a mixer just for my outputs. And if I need to throw in an input or a few to that, I can do that as well. Matrices can also be considered kind of lots and lots of buses, like loads of buses. We almost have to expand the way that we think about buses when we start talking about matrices. And our tagline for AHM originally when it came out was, rethinking the matrix. And that's very true, because we can't necessarily approach at least our matrix with this idea of, one input and one output, or just a summing of outputs. It's really like we have almost unlimited buses, depending on how you'd like to think about it. And we can dig into that more. But you could also consider a matrix maybe an audio distro. You just want to be able to take a few different blends of inputs or outputs and send them to many, many different locations. That's a very popular use for a matrix. It's just an ability to send a mix someplace else. If we want to have a conversation about how that's different from aux, we certainly can, but until somebody asks, I'll make the assumption that we all know the difference between those. And you could also kind of consider it a control or a processing hub, depending on the job that needs to get done. It's different for every project. Lots of my phone calls and my emails are about talking like, okay, well, here's what we want to do. Here's the end project. This is what we want it to look like. We were thinking about going this route. Is this the best possible way? Or maybe we should use a matrix instead of this, or maybe we should use a console instead. Those are just part of the conversation. So we'll tackle some of those today as well. So any questions or anything so far? Just talking about, what's defining a bit what's a console and what's a matrix. All right, I see heads shaking. I haven't seen anything pop in the chat. So, all right, onward. Oh, we got one. There is some, let me just back up. There's some confusion now with matrix because of the matrix systems like Crestron versus AV over IP. Yeah, and that's when you have to really kind of expand how you think about uh, matrices because it's not, I can't just say, truly the best way for me to like distill it down is just like the ability to take an input and point it towards an output, because once you start overly defining it, you're starting to get overly specific and leave out certain instances of it. Yes, okay, yep, routing system. That's a perfect distill of it as well. It's just a matrix can just be a routing system. Perfect. I like that. Dayton, you're hired. So, okay. So some key similarities between consoles and matrices. So for instance, they both process audio channels, and this is in general kind of matrices as a whole and consoles as a whole. Some of these are specific to our matrix or our console, so keep that in mind a little bit. But they both process audio channels. So on ours, I know that dynamics processing, including the histogram, is the same on a DLive, an Avantis, the AHM, and a lot of these are also in SQ, and some of it's even in Q. You know, that is how we process our dynamics. We said that 10-second histogram is important, so we put those in everything. We've got graphic and parametric EQ access for us. We have delays on inputs and outputs as well if we need them. The processes themselves, as you might process any channel of audio, is the same for both. Another key similarity is that they've got really flexible bus structures. So with ours, we let you program on the console side. We let you program what you would like your bus structure to kind of look like, which is extremely helpful for when you want one of more thing and less of another. If I need more groups, I can get myself more groups, or if I need more effects, I can do that as well. And as I was talking about earlier, with our matrices, it's almost like everything is a bus. Like you could almost consider everything a bus. Every point is its own bus. And I typically describe the outputs in an AHM system as an output bus because it helps people understand conceptually. This is just an output bus, and we can send whatever we want to it, and then we can tell it to go someplace, like go out of this input, go out of this output. You know, output number 3. So flexible bus structure. I can change it and use it how I need it. We've also got things like automatic mic mixing, and that's not on every single matrix or every single system processor, but a lot of them do. We'll have automatic mic mixers. I know that we've got source selectors, and I just talked about those last week, if you saw that. That was a good one, being able to pick a specific source to go out at a certain time, giving people the choice to pick between a small list of things. We also got DCAs, or control groups. You might consider those. And again, you could almost consider this a conversation between what's a bus. Like maybe we'll just have a mini master class on what is a bus, and how do we get there. So they both got DCAs or group control that in that way, and they're both kind of considered mixers. Mixers as in I'm taking inputs and I can change the level between them as I'm summing them. That makes sense. So I've got that. And really, I think it's important to note that there's a lot more in common with these than different. And so while I have a short list here, it's actually the similarities between a matrix and a console they're very, very close. So I think it's almost easier to just list off what is different. So I've got a comment here. Just thought, would it make sense to combine a DLive with an AHM matrix feature? Are you talking about a specific feature or just like in general combine them? Because yes to both, but I would just want to make sure I answer. And we'll get into that combination of them as well. So, okay, key differences here. So, yes, I will cover that because that is a very good idea. All right, key differences, making changes. Really, it's like you want to make a constant change versus an occasional change. Typically, if you're going to approach a console, you're looking to have like very quick, immediate changes, maybe multiple things at once. I mean, some of our larger DLive surfaces and the Avantis, for instance, both have multiple screens. So I can be, in theory, doing multiple things at one time using both of my hands. Where if you're starting to approach the matrix, I want to have things, I can make changes and I can make them quickly, but they are not meant to be as quick as humanly possible. I'm about to miss my cue. I need to go hit this one button way over here, sort of deal. The physical size, of course, is different. And this kind of opens up that can of worms where we're talking about, well, what about rack mount mixers? It's like, well, yes, those are those are consoles, and they are rack size. So physically, they're small. But then you end up needing to have there's either like an interface on the faceplate of it, or you have to use like an iPad of some kind. Uh, and that definitely blurs the lines a little bit between what a matrix is and what a console is in these kinds of differences. But the spirit of the differences is still the same in that even if it's a rack mount mixer, the approach is that I need to make changes really, really quickly, or I want to have things, different resources at hand. And we'll get to those more. So making changes, constant changes, constantly moving, constantly doing something, or occasional changes when I'm either setting it up, or lots of basic kind of commands like I want to let somebody mute and change their level a lot, but I don't need to have 40 inputs accessible to me at any given possible microsecond. So then we've got physical size, as we talked about. And then we also talk about accessibility. So consoles are really kind of generally for walk-up access. I want to be able to walk up and make these changes. And yes, I can have passwords on things. And yes, I can put a desk cover on it. And I can have our little booth set up and the door locks. But the real point being is I can walk up to this and make changes as necessary. And as you can just see on the HM64, at least, there's no buttons or anything on it. It's supposed to be very secure in that manner. Now, we just came out with and just announced our AHM16 and 32, which do have some buttons and some selectors and a little screen on the front. And that is to give a little bit more access for somebody when you want them to go up and touch it. With a system as large as the HM64, you pretty much don't want somebody walking up and doing something they shouldn't. And with those kinds of controls, it's very hard for somebody to get themselves into trouble. When you're on at a console, if you even really, it's more dangerous kind of knowing what you're doing, because if you have no idea what you're doing when you walk up to a console, I mean, you may touch a button or something, or poke around, but if you kind of know what you're doing on a console, it's really easy to accidentally recall a different show file, for instance, and then completely bomb whatever was just happening. That's a huge change. So we've got that, but then there's also this idea of permanence. So consoles, while yes, they are permanently installed in places, there's kind of this essence of change that I can, and even when you update like scenes, a scene updater on Avantis and DLive, it's really easy to kind of let it be this ever-changing beast where I'm making adjustments and saving them as I'm going, or I'm updating other scenes I've made. It's sort of meant to be this almost in this flux state all the time. Where if I was using like a matrix processor like the HM64, I'm really trying to make some things solid, and I don't ever want these things to change. Again, because you have to be very, very intentional about your changes. You have to be very intentional about your access, and it's not just whoever walks up to this thing and accidentally changes something they shouldn't have. So I've got that idea of permanence, but then also control. So we've sort of talked about this a little bit, but this intentional versus all control. So I have tons of control at my fingertips on the HM64. That's not a problem, but it's really, again, this idea of intentionality. Like I'm purposely going in and making this change when I want to make this change, rather than my hand slips and I touch the screen, or I'm hitting a button or something like that. Or I want to have all of the controls at my access. So again, this idea, if I walk up to a console, I can do as many changes as I want, as quickly as I can, and as easily as I possibly can, versus this idea of intentionality. Yes, I can control things, but I want to do it on purpose. So, and then there's this idea of security, which kind of plays into just the sheer amount of buttons on things. And we have ways of locking people out. Q and SQ are really popular with the House of Worship market, in particular, because they're very volunteer friendly and you can walk up to them and that's great. And with the larger consoles as well, you can create profiles, you can kind of push people and give them access, or let them make them log in to access something. But the point being, everything is just kind of there anyway. So even if I do lock them out, the stuff is just there. So I can be secure, but if I want it to be locked in an AV or an IT closet someplace, like untouchable, I can do that with the HM64. I'm never going to want to change the distribution for my PA. I'm never going to want to do that. So having that as part of the system locked someplace is sometimes exactly what I need. So we've got that. But then we've also got this idea of resources again. So if you wanted effects, like there's just typically not effects on matrix processors or system processors, or if they are, they're not very good. That's just not their design intention. So the effects that live inside of a console are supposed to be wonderful. It's supposed to sound good and you're supposed to want to use them. But then we've also got things like AEC and ANC, so acoustic echo cancellation, which is, to the best of my knowledge, only found in like system processors and matrix processors of that sort. Acoustic echo cancellation for things like video calls, and I've had a mini masterclass on that as well. Or ambient noise compensation. That's really specific to matrix or system processors as well, where I want to adjust the level of a zone, of an area in a building based on how loud it is in that area, which is incredibly helpful. But I would absolutely not want that on my live sound console, because then that, why would I want to adjust? I'll do the adjusting. I'm running the system. I'll tell it how loud I want it to be. And then speaker processing. So speaker processing can take a lot of power, a lot of processing power if done correctly. So sometimes having that offloaded onto a system processor is a lot more feasible or easier and more secure than having it on a console. So those are the key differences. Like if you're kind of thinking about a project, you think, well, maybe we can get away with having this, in HM16 instead of a Q something. Just remember, when people come up to me, I'm always like, okay, well, are you going to need effects at any point? Because if you need to add effects, you got to either use an outboard unit and use them as inserts on the AHM, or we have to go the normal console route, things like that. Okay, so when to use a console. So if you want to use a console, if you need to do as many complex changes as fast as you possibly can, I think I've said that enough times today, or if you want a myriad of effects and models, so things like a compressor model or a chorus effect, like that's just a very sort of more artsy approach to it and deserves to live inside of the more artsy sort of processing here, which would be the mixing console. And you want to use a matrix if you don't want anyone to accidentally change the system, which is a huge piece of conversation every single week for me, is wanting to give somebody access but not letting them hurt themselves. If you want to distribute many mixes of audio to many different locations, a matrix will be a really good use for that. Or if you want audio processing without the need of an entire console. So if we want, I've had some people use an AHM to do some small band gigs in a part of a hotel before, and they didn't need any effects, or there was a small system and they were going to provide it anyways. They just needed a way to get the audio into the system in the hotel and distribute it appropriately. That was a perfect use for the HM. So that's when you would use either or. So then the real question is, okay, well, when would we want to use both? And this is when designs get really fun. So if you want to get the best of both worlds, if you want, system processing, but you want all of the kind of creativity and heft that you can get in a console, using these together can offer you a lot. So maybe you want to give people access to the audio world without giving them the keys to the kingdom. This is maybe one of the best uses of for people who are just kind of understanding AHM, is if they've got an audio system in a venue or maybe a sanctuary someplace, and they want to be able to process audio in different rooms, but they don't always need the sanctuary or the main part of the venue on. Using an HM, for instance, or another matrix processor can sort of give a little bit of a separation of control. So I can let them have access to AV without interrupting or using the whole part of the venue that may be in the sanctuary or the main production area of the venue. It's almost like this separating the brain just a tad, instead of two heads are better than one, right? So being able to give them control and audio processing that can work in tandem with a DLive or whatever system, can work in a system in tandem with the main sort of console system in the venue, being able to work together and also separately makes them very powerful. Or maybe you want to offload some of the control or the bus processing from the console. So maybe I'm using the SQ and I just need all of those buses. I need them for auxes so I can send them to musicians' ears, but we still have some zones or some areas that I would still like to process, but I want these to work together well. Sometimes a matrix is the perfect answer for that, because then the console can focus on its job that it's supposed to be doing and it doesn't need to worry about giving people access to control or audio feeds if they don't want them to have access to. So as an example, one that just recently came up was they wanted to have a D-Live system in a ballroom, and they always have like breakout rooms or smaller classrooms. And so they want to always have the classrooms on and going and have access, but sometimes they're using the ballrooms for a huge production that needs a console, and sometimes they're not. So by tagging on an HM, for instance, in this project, we let people come and go into these classrooms and have total use of them without even touching those main ballrooms. But when the ballroom time comes, it's flick of the wrist, so to speak, and we can be passing audio between the two systems as if they were one the entire time, which can be super great. So that means anybody using the classroom can't accidentally mess anything up for whatever reason, can't mess anything up in the ballroom, and the ballroom can't necessarily mess up anything in the classrooms. It's kind of this nice little separation when we want it, and combination of these systems at whenever we'd like to. So we've got that. And that really tells to some days you'll be using a mix of the audio system and traditional AV. That's a really big thing now, is more productions are getting more into IT and AV stuff, and more traditional AV stuff is getting, whether they like it or not, really approached with, when we want to care about audio or when we want it to act a certain way, we have to care more about it. So got that. And you want the console to control the audio inputs, but let another device control the outputs and distribution. So yes, I'm grabbing some inputs from maybe the main room. We'll just say sanctuary because everybody knows what that is. So maybe I want to grab a couple of inputs from the sanctuary, and instead of making my D-Live feed this one room or my entire lobby or the fleet of classrooms, I can use an HM to grab those inputs from the D-Live side, and it's now kind of living on its own, and I can distribute those as I feel necessary to as many classrooms or to as few places as I need. And the D-Live doesn't need to worry about it. The operator of the D-Live doesn't need to worry about it. So, okay, that has been lots, and I think some chats came in. Yes, Sam, you did just do something very similar to this. All right, Jason, I could see that being very useful in a school environment that is used, good Lord, that is used as a multi-use space. Absolutely. Some days, or sometimes rather, it's turnkey, but other times with bands, musicals, consoles can be used. 100%, Jason. In particular, speaking to, since I'm an expert on Alan Heath's matrix processor, the HM, I see that it fits extremely well into those areas, like spaces that use both the production and more traditional AV. The HM just goes very well into that. It's easy to kind of implement it. I can get the musical piece and I can get that traditional AV if I need it as well. It's like it lives right between them, and so it's a good conduit. So another thought, PA system, especially in school. Yep, I've had some people use this matrix processor for the PA system in a school. They actually used it for their paging. They also did their bells through it and things like that. So it was very interesting and very cool projects. Then we got another one. Are those inputs shared via Dante? They can if you want them to be. You could also share them over SoundGrid or MADI or our proprietary protocols, Alan Heath stuff. If you wanted to keep it in-house, so to speak, you can do that. It all depends on how you'd like to set your system up or where you're sending it to. So, yeah. Whew. All right, guys, this was lots of information. So, any other questions, anything that may come up or anything that wasn't quite clear, I'd be happy to go over. All right, so we got another one. Would it be impractical for Alan and Heath to give the SQ series the option of including inputs into a matrix mix? I believe that you can on an SQ. I'd have to quadruple check less, but I'm feeling like you can. You have to like I think you have to go a little bit around. It's not as obvious as you think it would be, with the intention of, again, you're sort of doing it on purpose and not accidentally. Poll. Is Maddie being used much anymore? Dante is taking over distribution of audio. Well, you would be correct, Dane. If this was 6 months ago, you would be 100% correct. So, I don't know if, well, first of all, Maddie's used a lot in broadcast stuff, and I think they're pretty happy doing that. And Audinate was well on their way to, frankly, taking over all of audio distribution for the most part when you start talking about third-party stuff. But there's some problems, some chip shortages and stuff like that. So I think people are, you know, kind of waiting to see. Yes, Dante is fantastic. I really enjoy Dante. It's incredibly useful. But it kind of depends on the use is what it comes down to. It depends on the use, and as of this year, and the availability of things. So I've written an article and done like podcast episodes talking about Dante versus other protocols, or what we need to understand about audio over Ethernet as a whole, and things like that sort. There are pros and cons to keep things proprietary and non-proprietary. There's reasons to pick layer 3 over layer 2 protocols. Like, I mean, we could really get into it. I don't know if anybody wants to sit here and listen to me talk about that, but okay. So depends what you talk about. Avid is a different beast. Yeah, Maddie is way more stable than Dante. It is definitely, once you plug it in and you're fine, then yeah, you're good. But I guess you could make that argument over with Dante as well. Like, once it's set up, it should be fine. But and it's not. Yes, Maddie's more stable and not network based. Purely because it's not network based means that it's more stable, I guess. But it's really kind of Kelly, that was very diplomatic. You gotta be, Kelly. You gotta be diplomatic. Networked audio is awesome. At least if we're talking, I'm assuming when we talk about networked audio, we're talking about layer 3 networked audio. We're talking about layer 3 networked audio. You're really kind of getting into it because it's extremely flexible, and you can just like, there are very few limitations on what we can do. When you're talking about layer 2 audio over Ethernet, that is a point to point and acts way more like Maddie. And so I would argue that they're even more reliable for the simple fact that it's not relying on like third-party hardware, like network switches or whatever, or just purely third-party anything. So I'd like to read your articles. I am Dante level 3 and sound good. Also, perfect. Dante level 3 is great. If you haven't already done, they re-released all 3 levels of Dante a few months ago, I guess maybe last spring at this point, but they were very good and I really enjoyed them. Okay. Dayton, if you ping me your email address, I can send you those articles. They're on ProSound Web, so it's free to subscribe. You can go read them if you'd like. Okay, let's on the routing screen on the SQ4U app, I can route mixes, but I don't see any option to route an individual input to a matrix. Yeah, I will check on that, Les. I feel like you have to go slightly. I think it's on the routing. I'm trying to do this from memory. So I think if you go to the inputs or routing page, or maybe you have to go the opposite way, in through the matrix, and then look and see what's being sent there. I'll triple check, Les, and I'll get that for you. Let's see. It says layer 2 ADB is also layer 2, which takes over. Yeah, like when you're talking about layer 2, again, it's like a point to point. It's not really advisable to do like VLANs and stuff on you especially shouldn't do converged networks. So that's when you start having to have the conversation about what's the difference between audio over Ethernet and audio over IP, which, all audio over IP could be considered audio over Ethernet, but not the other way around. Not all audio over Ethernet is audio over IP. Whew. Okay. Broadcast using Dante is more flexible than Maddie. Yeah, and people are moving to Dante, and that's totally cool. Um, I know that some like movie studios and other stuff like that, production houses are using Maddie still. They're asking for it. So the requests are coming in. I just all right. Okay, I've got your email, Dane. All right, so we have this has been great conversation. So I will release you all now. I'll hang out. We can keep talking about networked audio if you guys would like. Would be happy to. Getting a better understanding of when I should use a matrix or when I should use a console. I'm here for you. You guys know I'm a resource, so feel free to ping me. I'll even drop my email in again. I haven't done that in a while, actually. There we go. If you guys ever have a question, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, thanks for hanging and listening as always. Next week's going to be a pretty good one about some, I believe it's some customer control stuff. I have to go check the calendar. It's on the Allen Heath page now. And I think an email just went out last night with the full calendar. So, okay. All right. You all be amazing. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.